Session 4 of Living Without Fear. And the next lesson the Hebrew people needed to learn was that God was their provider. They'd experienced his protection, they'd experienced the miracle of his crossing the Red Sea. They'd got to the other side and they'd sung praises to God, how wonderful he was. And then they set out into the desert and only went 3 days and hadn't been able to find any water. On the third day, or the fourth day, they found water, but it was undrinkable, it was bitter. They seemed very quickly to forget that God was there watching over them and looking after them, and so they began to complain to Moses bitterly. God told Moses to throw a particular piece of wood into the water and it became quite drinkable. From there they set out to a place called Elim, which apparently was a sort of an oasis. It had water and had palm trees, and they stayed there a little while. From there they set on towards Mount Sinai. It had been about 6 weeks since they'd left Egypt, and they started to complain about food, lack of it. They wanted meat. And so, they said, look, in Egypt we could sit around flesh pots of meat and eat all we wanted to, and we're out here starving. God heard their grumbling and he responded. In the evening, quail came and they just landed on the ground. They didn't even have to shoot them. They just had to pick them up, cook them and eat them. In the morning, there was a sort of a dew on the ground, and when the dew disappeared, what was left behind were like white flakes, and they were told to gather that. To gather enough for each person for a day, and it was 1 omer they were to gather. They weren't to gather anymore, and they weren't to store it up. But human beings being human beings, some of them did store up and try and save some for the next day, only to find that it had maggots in it. It had gone horrible smell. On the 6th day, they would collect enough for 2 days, because the 7th day was to be a day of rest. And they were told not to collect it on the 7th day. They'd have enough stored up from the 6th day. But again, human beings being human beings, some of them went out on the 7th day to collect manna. And of course, there was none. And Moses got really cross that they just weren't listening to instructions. But it was a lesson from God that he was their provider. They needed to trust that he would provide enough for each day. There was no need to store things up. By storing it up or going out on the 7th day, they were just showing a lack of trust in God. And God wanted to learn that they could trust him day by day. They were slow learners. When they moved on from Elim, it wasn't long before they were complaining again for lack of water. Surely by now they would realise it's okay, God will provide in some way. The first time they'd complained, there'd been water there, just wasn't drinkable, and Moses had to throw a stick in to make it drinkable. This time there was no sign of water, but God said to Moses, take your stick and strike the rock. And when he did, water gushed out from the rock. God is our provider. Matthew 6:25. Therefore I tell you, do not worry about life, what you will eat or drink or what you will wear. Do not worry saying, what shall we eat, what shall we drink, what shall we wear? For the pagans run after these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given you as well. We need to learn that God will provide. Worry is a lack of trust.
Jehovah Jireh, my provider, his grace is sufficient for me. Jehovah Jireh, my provider, his grace is sufficient for me. My God shall supply all my needs, according to his riches in glory. He gives his angels charge over me. Jehovah Jireh cares for me. Jehovah Jireh cares for me. Jehovah Jireh, my provider, his grace is sufficient for me. Jehovah Jireh, my provider, his grace is sufficient for me. My God shall supply all my needs according to his riches in glory. He gives his angels charge over me. Jehovah Jireh cares for me. Jehovah